power is understood, the way we understand it, and the way in which power is used, particularly in institutions, also the way power is used in government, and so on. It's really sayang that this topic is spoken about and thought about so little. Because the issue of power is always the elephant in the room. And I think that all of us, some of us have had a slightly longer life experience than others. It's really wonderful to see some younger people here. A very big welcome, especially to you. I think I'm just a little bit older than some of you younger people that are here. And I don't know about you, but I have at times, including in Christian institutions, I have experienced some oppressive forms of power rather than the power of encouragement or the power of celebration or the power of working together and so on. So power in itself is good, but it can be misused. And so what we want to do this evening is we want to look at this particular topic from both philosophical and theological perspectives. We have a handout for you. So what that means is that you can just fall asleep during the whole lecture and then kind of wake up and then you just take it home and there you have it. But I trust that you will not fall asleep. But if you do, okay lang, right? But we're going to do something which is a little closer to home. I think that one of the things that you are very aware of is that that ATS also has a counselling department. ATS also teaches spiritual theology. So the way in which to live the Christian life has to do with head, heart, and hand. So head has to do with theological formation. The heart has to do with spirituality. And the hand has to do with mission and ministry. So what we're going to do is, after my lecture, we're going to break up into small groups. I suggest the group should be no bigger than about 4 people. Is that okay? And I will then tell you what to do, but I just want to preempt so that you can begin thinking about what the small group is about. I would like you, in the small group setting, without mentioning any names and not mentioning any organisation, because that's not the point. We're not on about naming and we're not on about blaming, but we are on about storytelling. And what I'd like you to share in the group, and then we'll think about how we're going to get some feedback, whether you are willing to share an incident where you have experienced the misuse of power towards you as a person. But you don't implicate people and you don't implicate an organisation. Is that clear? And then secondly, we would like you to share in the group examples that you have seen of people who have exercised their power in empowering kind of ways. So negative story, Muna, and then a positive story, secondly. And then I'll ask the small groups to do some other things. But these are the 2 things that I'd like you to be thinking about so that this topic then becomes grounded and personal and gives you an opportunity to come in touch with the way in which you have experienced power both for good and ill. Is that okay? All right. So here's the handout. And if somebody would like to, more or less from the back, if you'd like to, if you just, thank you, just bring that towards the back, then so the whole lecture of this evening is basically here. Then because I am a post-Christendom, post-modern, post-denominational person, and also post-PowerPoint person, we're going to have some overheads. Can you believe it? Can you believe that in 2016 at ATS there is a professor who is going to put on some overhead projections? Isn't that fantastic? So it just goes to show what a sort of a dinosaur I in fact am. Okay, does everyone have a copy? Not enough? If there's not enough, we'll do some more. Are we okay? Wonderful. So let's then look at the introduction, where we asked the question, why are we looking at this topic? Well, as I've already mentioned, it's a topic that is seldom dealt with in the present day church, yet power is very much a part of daily life, and it is a part of all social institutions. There are power relationships in every social institution, including in the church. When power is spoken about within the church, I believe it's often done in a very glib and unreflective way. So one of the things is that we rightly speak about power in the church, about living in the power of the Spirit. That's a good way of speaking about power. We also hear, for example, that Jesus, I'm quoting from various authors, Jesus chose the path of powerlessness, and therefore so must we. Or others say that power is coercive, therefore we must choose the path of love. So here you have an example of Tony Campolo, who's a very respected evangelical, who actually makes a kind of a contrast between love and power. And in his book, he actually suggests that we should reject power and simply embrace the path of love. So one of the things that you may want to think about immediately was this. Was Jesus, in every sense of the word, a powerful person? If you look at Jesus in terms of what he did and so on. So think about that. Is it possible, for example, to be both loving and to exercise power? Is that a possibility? You need to think about that. So there are also Christians who say that Christianity and living the Christian life is not about power, but it's about serving the Lord in weakness, and so on. So already from these quotes, you can get a bit of a sense that Christians tend to be a little bit ambivalent around the whole topic of power. The other comment that I want to make by way of introduction is that there is quite a body of literature in relation to the misuse of power within the churches. Foster points out that the misuse of religious power is particularly destructive. The reason for that is very, very simple. So if you think, for example, of a person in the church, a leader in the church, and you see that person as God's spokesperson, and that person then is abusive towards you in some way, what happens then is that not only is your relationship with this person affected, but your relationship with God as a consequence can then also be affected. So Foster makes the point that position and religion and spirituality is a very, very strong combination. And when that is misused in some way, it can make a huge impact, a negative impact. On the other hand, Foster goes on to say that creative power is the power to restore, to heal, to liberate. And if that is done by persons of humility, vulnerability, and servanthood, then in fact the use of power can be life-giving instead of disempowering and bringing hurt and wounding to people. So this is simply just by way of thinking about this important topic. So what we want to do now is we want to have a look at what are some of the basic understandings of power. Most basically, power has to do with an ability to have an effect, the ability to achieve something, the ability to do something, the ability to make an impact. And that is the most basic definition of power. And therefore, the consequence of that is that all of us exercise power in some sort of way. Just as much as we all have a human agency. So one of the things that we need to realize that it is possible, for example, through very deep wounding, for a person to develop a kind of a victim mentality or to feel that I am powerless, I can't do anything. And it is true that people can be incredibly oppressed. But most of us, irrespective of our general circumstances, have an ability to do something, however small that might be. So it's important in terms of people realizing that they have human agency and that they can do something. And that is why, in the bigger scheme of things, when it comes to big issues that have to do with the role of the church in the world, or the struggle for justice, or whatever the case may be, it is so easy for people to feel that they can do nothing. Whereas the reality is that we can do a small thing in most circumstances and in most situations. And in this class, we have seen the movie Amazing Grace, the work of William Wilberforce in seeking to end the slave trade. And in that movie, we learned that there were hundreds of thousands of ordinary Christians in England at that time who refused to use sugar as a way of protesting the slave trade. So in other words, they did something as opposed to doing nothing. There was human agency and there was a sense that they were using in a small way their individual power, which then became amalgamated in a very significant power because it was impacting people who owned the sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So in other words, what happened was that then began to hurt the hacienda owners in terms of their economic reality. And that then helped to bring about a change and eventually helped to end the slave trade. So let us then don't think that we can do nothing. Power basically means the ability to have an effect, to do something, to make an impact. A little ripple, maybe, as opposed to a tsunami. Although we're not really happy thinking about tsunamis, are we? But anyway, you know what I mean. The second thing that we need to realize is that we can only see power apart from those who hold positions of power in its outworking and when it makes an impact. We see power at work because it affects us in some way. And that's one of the things that I want you to think about when you go into the small group. You have been affected and impacted by the power that others have exercised towards you for both good and also for ill. And we want you to get in touch with that. Thirdly, and this is a very, very important concept because it has all sorts of implications. Power is a dynamic that lies between people, and particularly between leaders and followers. It lies between, whereas we have a tendency to think that power is simply residual in the person who is in a position of power. So the CEO of a corporation, or the manager of a business, or the executive director of a parachurch organization, or the pastor in your church, we have a tendency to think that the power is simply residing in that particular person. But that is a very, very inadequate way of understanding the nature of power. Power basically lies between the CEO and the other persons in the corporation. The power lies between the pastor and the people. So what happens is, because the pastor is in a position of power, you as a member of the congregation, to the degree that you listen to the pastor, to the degree that you love the pastor, to the degree that you respect the pastor, to that degree you are giving power to the pastor. I must tell you a funny story. This was when I was in the Reformed Church in Brisbane. And there was an older gentleman in the church who did not respect the pastor too much. And what he had was that he had a hearing aid that he was able to manipulate and adjust in his pocket. So if he would have sat in front of the pastor as soon as he got up to preach the sermon and started adjusting his hearing aid, then the pastor would have known that he was probably switching off his hearing aid, or maybe the pastor thought that he was switching up the hearing aid, but he really switched it off every time. He never listened to a sermon because he did not respect the pastor. So did the pastor then have power in relation to this member, even though the pastor had a position of power? And the answer is no, because that particular gentleman did not hold respect for the pastor, and as a consequence tuned out, which of course you can also do by not switching off a hearing aid. You can simply tune out with your eyes wide open. You can also do that in terms of a lecturer, diba? Hello? Yes, I'm concentrating with my eyes open, but I am somewhere else. Now, what's the point then of recognizing that power lies between people? Well, what that means is that you then also have more power than what you realize. So a person has the position of power, but to the extent that you respect that person and are willing to listen to that person, you are giving power back to that person. The power actually lies in a dynamic between the two of you. So I think this is a very, very important concept for us to understand, because we tend to see power simply residual in the person of power. Now, in social science theory, there is then this recognition that in every communal situation or in any social gathering or in any institution, any parachurch organization, what happens is power is asymmetrical. So what that means is it is not evenly distributed. You will notice that, for example, even among the laity, no? There are persons who are simply part of the congregation who somehow are able to exercise more influence than others. But in any situation, the power relationships are asymmetrical. They're out of sync. One person seems to have more power than another person. And as a consequence, this can have all kinds of emotional impacts on a person who feels that they have less power, therefore they have a sense that they don't have as much human agency as they would like. They can then feel a sense of inferiority or being marginalized or whatever the case may be. So we need to recognize that in ourselves that we have that kind of reaction, and that happens in many social settings where we realize that, for example, a particular person is more dominant, and you somehow feel that you're being railroaded or slightly put down by that particular person. That's why, for example, you need to be very sensitive in terms of small group discussion. Have you ever noticed that if you put 4 or 5 people in a small group, that there are certain people who virtually take over and do all the talking? And then you're kind of sitting there thinking, well, how are you really thinking? Well, if you're really honest in terms of what you're thinking, you're really thinking, zip. I hope that person goes zip. You know, zips up their mouth, but they just keep talking. So what happens then is you feel, well, what's the point of a small group discussion? Do I have nothing to say? Do I have nothing to contribute? And so forth and so on. So even in a small setting like that, in a place such as ATS, we can have a very, very simple personal experience in relation to the asymmetrical nature of power relationships. That was point number 4, right? Point number 5. I should have numbered this, but anyway, these little dots are quite confusing. So social scientists talk about the fact that power has a field force or it has certain conductors. Now that's a very, very fascinating idea. So let me give you an idea of what a field force could look like within an institution. So something like this. Okay, are you with me? Yeah, just watch me waving my hands. Okay, so you have the president, and then you have the secretary of the president. And what happens is the president communicates to the secretary, and the secretary sends a memo to all of the staff in relation to a particular issue that they have to do. There's a sort of electricity, there's a force, there is a field force, and it's being conducted from the president through the secretary through the means of the memo. So one of the things that you need to begin to do in your imagination is begin to think about how power and influence travels within social systems and how things are communicated and what channels are being used, what methods are being used in order to get you to do a particular thing in terms of a command or an instruction or whatever the case might be. So think about conductors then, or channels. Can I just say at this particular point in time that the more conductors you have in terms of a mandate or a request or an instruction, the greater the possibility that the mandate will somehow be manipulated and can be either weakened or can be strengthened depending on what goes on within a particular social system. Let me give you a very simple example. It is possible, and social scientists have been particularly interested in the idea that disciples are often worse than their master in the use of power. Does that make sense? Have you ever experienced the fact that when you meet the leader, you find that person nowhere near as gung-ho or difficult or managerial or whatever, but down the line, all the people down the line that you have to deal with somehow have reinforced instructions and attitudes and values and so forth and so on, and have actually made this person back here look much more dictatorial and oppressive than that person really is. Put it in another way, disciples are not always a good reflection of their master. And that also happens in terms of the way in which power relationships operate. The further point, I can't count anymore because once I get over 5, I'm just completely lost, right? Okay, one of the things that we need to realize is that different forms of power may occur in different circumstances, and I think we should put that much more strongly. In certain circumstances, a very different form of power needs to be exercised and needs to emerge if we're going to have appropriate responses to changing circumstances and changing situations. Now, the person, of course, who is at the back of this particular statement is Max Weber, the great German sociologist, who has been very astute in thinking about the way in which the modern world has begun to develop, and actually has likened it to the iron cage. So in other words, our way of life has become more and more structured and so forth and so on. But Weber believed, and we do too, that no matter how much you try to structure life, sooner or later cracks begin to appear. People want more room to breathe. People are bored out of their brain in terms of the iron cage. A particular way of being and acting and so on. Or a particular way of acting and being in the world no longer works. So people then become open to new possibilities. And when you become open to new possibilities, Max Weber is saying, what you then need is charismatic power. So charismatic power is not, so Weber is not thinking about Pentecostals at all. What he's simply thinking about is creative power. The need to come up with new ideas. The need to be innovative, the need to be risk-taking, and so forth and so on. So particularly when there are situations and times in a society or a culture which are times of difficulty and crisis, then charismatic power is something that needs to emerge. So those of you who are thinking about how to respond to current situations here in the Philippines, here is a word for you. Creative power, charismatic power, thinking out of the box, being creative, risk-taking, and so on, becomes a very real challenge and option. Now we need to understand that power can be traditional, which is a wise person in a community or tribe. It can be organizational, which is a priest or a CEO. By the way, I'm absolutely appalled by the fact that there are increasingly pastors in our churches who have taken away the word pastor and have replaced it with CEO of a particular church. You're not a CEO of a particular church. You are the shepherd of the people of God. And if you want to be a CEO, go and run a business or a corporation. So we have traditional power, we have organizational power, we have moral power. So that has to do with the power of a virtuous life or a life of integrity. So we've seen, for example, the movie of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany. Bonhoeffer virtually had no real positional power once the confessing church began to collapse. But he had moral power. He had a profound vision in terms of what was right and what he believed that God wanted him to do in very, very difficult circumstances. So traditional, organizational, moral, and then spiritual, that we become an agent of spiritual forces, and within a Christian framework, that then has to do with the work of the Holy Spirit. Now, what I want you to think about now is compounded power and fragmented power. When we talk about compounded power, we're talking about spiritual, moral, and organizational power being residual in the same person. So a person is a priest, but this person also leads a virtuous life, is a person of prayer and integrity, so on. And is also a person who's committed to serving the poor and being committed to justice and so forth and so on. So you see various, and at the same time, the person is open to the work of the Holy Spirit. So compounded power. The opposite can also occur, and that's fragmented. And this is particularly troubling for us when we work within Christian organizations. So what if you have in your parachurch organization a person who is very strongly exercising organizational power, but is not a person of prayer or a person of humility? Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know such people? Do they exist? Have they ever come across your path? Ouch. Okay, I want to just make one more point, and then I'm going to throw it open for some questions. But I think we're all kind of suffering a little bit in this room in terms of the heat. So we've got the fans on, we've got all the air cons on. So maybe what I might do is during our class time together, I may in fact get you to take your body warmth out of the room for a couple of minutes. And if you can just kind of flap your wings out in the street so you can cool down a little bit, and then you can bring your reduced body warmth back into the room. We may need to do that in order to survive. But let me just make this last point. You need to realize that the nature of the use of power is mainly hidden. And power most clearly manifests itself when those who are in power are resisted. So Jacques Ellul, quote, "It's the responsibility of the Christian to say yes. It's also the responsibility of the Christian to say no." What happens when you say no? You will experience something that you won't experience when you say yes. When you say yes, everything is basically okay. But when you say no, and you go on then to give the reasons why you are saying no, you will then begin to feel the dynamic of power coming from those to whom you are saying no. I have a different perspective. I believe we shouldn't take this particular route. I think this is a wrong understanding. So the moment we begin to say no, or the moment we resist, at that point you can most clearly begin to feel the nature of power. So think about that. And please think about the consequence of that. Because what is the basic psychological consequence of that? It is that we will hesitate and often fail to say no because we don't want the experience of feeling the power of others in terms of rejection or whatever the case may be. Come on, you know this from your own experience. I know this from my own experience. Have you ever had the experience when your telephone is bugged and the police come to your family home when you're there at home with your wife and your small children, and they walk into your house and they threaten you about certain things right in front of your family and right in front of your small children? You feel an incredible power, and you're fearful, and you realize how incredibly fragile and vulnerable you in fact are. And if you're just a small player in an organization, you're not even middle management, you're just staff within a big business, and you raise your voice about something, bang! The force, the field force of power that can push you down and shut you up and close you down can be absolutely incredible. So therefore, what does that then mean? Well, basically what it means is that, and let's now translate that into a broader setting. If you want to work in terms of some form of critique or seeking to point a different pathway to the powers that be, you better make sure that you are part of a community of resistance and that you're not a solo person. Because we will buckle under the pressure. And that's why community is such an incredibly important theme in terms of the way God works. God is a God who brings into being a people. Jesus, through the Spirit, builds the church. We need companions on the journey in terms of the work of when we say no, in order to work towards building a better world.